Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I actually didn't really expect that many people, but it's great. There is no like not like a super like hard agenda for this session. I think it was more about like kind of introducing everyone that's been working or is interested in FOCIL. But there is like a couple of things I would love to have at the end of this meeting. Um, Okay, maybe we should start with like some broad questions on like the actual design and maybe like the research part. Like, are there like any outstanding questions or like are people like wondering what's going on with like the design? Is everyone familiar with it? Like, are there like any questions on the actual like research and design side of things, or can we actually move towards discussing more like implementations and the different clients and who is going to work on what?
I think the one question I have is there still going to be movement in the spec? It seems like it's fairly well defined, but do you guys expect more PRs?
Uh, so on the spec itself, on like the design itself, I don't think there will be much changes, to be honest. Like we were like going a bit back and forth when we were like trying to figure out whether we wanted to maybe make a push for FOSIL to use transaction hashes instead of full transactions at some point, but seems like we are going to settle with like full transactions, and that's actually how the spec is right now. Um, it's worth mentioning that the spec is way, I would say, like more established on the CL than on the EL side right now. Um, but I don't think like the core principles behind like how things are done will change. It's just about like maybe making like the EL spec a bit more like an actual PR rather than just like formulated as we did in the AAB. The size limit for full transactions, so it's 8 kilobytes per IL, and we have 16 IL committee members right now in the spec.
I guess it would be good to clarify the things that we're not going to include in this version one, like blobs, for example.
Yeah, blobs are not included, and I mean another like thing that's not included is a reward mechanism for IL committee members. Right now, we just rely on altruistic participation. I think that it's worth mentioning because uh, I think it works fine as is because we have like cool properties. Like for example, like we only need one IL committee member to actually participate honestly for the mechanism to work as expected. But yeah, so it won't include blobs and it won't include like a specific reward mechanism for IL committee members right now. Yeah, Francesco, do you want to maybe talk about the for choice
Yeah,
section?
just basically something that is not quite done in the for choice spec, which is not just specific to FOCIL. It's just one of these things that keeps, for years sort of being a potentially interesting thing to do that helps this or that thing. Like it would be nice in PeerDAS as well. It'd potentially be nice in other places like EPBS if we ever actually wanted to do that. Is this basically block slot for choice, which is essentially the ability to say, I don't want this block to end up canonical. And yeah, basically saying if there is a majority of people saying that, actually rejecting such a block from the fourth choice, more or less. So right now we don't have that, and that's the enforcement part of FOCIL will basically need to rely on something a bit weaker, which would basically be that if you don't get enough votes, then the next proposer can reorg you with proposer boost. So it's a bit weaker because, for one thing, the kind of threshold to be reorged is lower, like, or sorry, higher, like you can yeah, I mean, basically it's you don't get like a honest majority kind of level of security for this enforcement mechanism. And then the other thing is just that the next proposer might just decide not to do this, like they might be colluding or whatever. And so right now that's what the enforcement model is. It's a bit weaker, and we might eventually decide to do this more general, like fortress construction, which among other things would help FOCIL. But I think it's not like a super urgent thing, and it basically doesn't really touch any other part of the mechanism. It's more like this kind of separate for choice mechanism that just happens to also help here. So I don't think it's really particularly, yeah, important to like to worry about this in terms of stability of the spec.
Yeah, cool. No, that makes sense. I do feel like I also saw it like as a maybe separate EIP, but we could also think of it as like a bundle if it actually help with a few upgrades we want to make at the same time. Yeah, cool. Does anyone have other questions on the design itself, its properties, attacks, like anything that is on your mind? Okay, great. Then we can maybe go ahead and see who wants to do what, which is more of a coordination question, but I think it's quite important right now because so FOCIL co-authors, I guess, have been like started to work on some kind of implementation. Specifically, we have Jacob that has worked on kind of the Wraith and Lighthouse prototype. I can link his note in the chat. Okay. And then we have Jihoon that has been making progress on Geth, and Terence that made a bit of progress on Prism as well. So I think it would be important to like signal interest, but also like commitment in terms of who want to like contribute on the FOCIL implementation, on what client, and what kind of like yeah, what is like a how much time will you allocate to this basically? And then there were some good comments. Okay, I'll preface this, but like there were some good comments on maybe like our devs, yeah, will want to like focus on shipping PeerDAS and Pectra, which is completely fair. I was thinking like we do have like some external contributors that are not core dev, but that still want to contribute and help out. So at least having like some like kind of key point of contact people that external contributors can reach out to when if they want to help on a particular client would be super useful.
It's actually a good thing. Maybe we could post in the notes or in the channel and pin it is who's working on it for which clients, just to make it easier for us to interact if necessary.
Yeah. But maybe even here, like who, maybe just like can you don't be shy, or maybe just write it in the chat. But like if you're interested in actually working on it, it would be good to like signal it here.
Yeah, from Teku side, we have been interested since the first versions of IL that kind of failed initially with several problems. So definitely we are interested to allocate some time following and maybe time to do some experiments on this and maybe some interop. But so far I can't evaluate how much effort we're gonna put into this. It's something that we we'll start sharing internally, and then we come up with kind of an allocation. But definitely, we would like to start working on it. It seems like it's definitely more stable spec, because the initial EL effort was been a little bit of a waste of time, because we started and then suddenly we got several problems and stopped. But now I think this is much more mature. So yeah, that's something we want to do.
Okay, great. That's awesome. And then will you be like the kind of point of contact person
Yeah,
if people
definitely.
want to reach out?
I can be for sure for APAC time zones. Paul will be probably the one, but yeah, we can reach us when. Yeah, I'm already in the old EL channel, so
Okay, great.
yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, sometimes it's just about like people coming in and wanting to, I don't know, like ask you a few questions about like resources or like places to where it's best to make their contribution. So it's great to have
Sure. You're welcome
that.
to DM me or ping me there.
And okay, work in progress pull request on Go Ethereum makes sense for sure. Anyone else? Maybe Jihoon, do you want to talk about like what the progress you've made and maybe where you're at? Because you've been working on Get a bit, right?
Yes. So the Get prototype implements actually quite most of the execution specs, but it hasn't go through testing yet. So I'm planning to run Get and Prism locally starting next week. And for the execution specs that the Get prototype is, it follows, it can be found at the link that I attached at the chat. So they are all implemented with its own unit tests. But one question that I want to ask to EL developers is that, so there are 3 new engine APIs, and one of them is new payload v5. So, and that API checks if the new given payload follows inclusion list constraints or not, except when the node is syncing. So the EL needs to tell if the node is syncing or not. One possible option is to use timestamp field of execution payload, but I'm not sure if this is the convention of EL to figure it out. So yeah.
No, I mean in general, the node kind of knows when it's syncing, but yeah, I mean basically during the initial, I mean the engine API is also the trigger for syncing, so that's something to keep in mind. It's like when the client starts up, it's basically not syncing, but then once the engine API is triggered and it detects that the head block is kind of ahead, then it will launch sync. So then it's like, but there is like, especially in Geth, there isn't really like this central place that manages the syncing status. So that's maybe something that you are missing, or
So if I understood correctly, if the new payload v5 is called, I can just safely assume that the node is not syncing.
I'm not sure about that assumption, to be honest. I mean, they basically, the engine API just gets called all the time, but it's up to the execution layer to decide within if it's like currently in syncing status.
Yeah, and CL calls EL new payload even to do some basic validation that can be done even if the node is non-syncing. So
Mm.
it does some checks over the block and then returns syncing, and then CL goes into optimistic sync, knowing that the EL is still doing its job and needs to take care of that.
So let me jump in and clarify Jinhoo's question. So basically at FOSSIL, there is this new constraint that the inclusion list constraint actually is enforced at the slot of. So meaning that given the current timestamp, we know what is the current slot is, right? So basically, and this is only when the inclusion list matters, basically. So to clarify the question is more like, we do not want to check inclusion list if it's not the current slot, and whether it's okay to add that responsibility to the EL, meaning that when I call new payload, I don't want to check anything about inclusion list if it's not the current slot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird constraint, to be honest. Like, I mean, the execution layer only knows what's the current slot based on the request it gets from the CL. So, I mean, it has the head, which is sort of the latest, but it doesn't. There's never any place where we check, like, is this the current slot based on time?
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's a fair feedback. So, but then again, I think like this is just the first like breakout call. It's probably too early to like dive into this type of implementation detail. So maybe we can like, yeah, maybe we can. I see Jin who has like a HackMD on the engine API execution spec. So maybe we can like, he can open a PR and we can just leave the feedback there and go from there.
I mean, I guess just fundamentally, maybe just to dig into it just a tiny bit.
Sure.
Conceptually, there are two different cases in the engine API, right? I mean, when the CL triggers the engine API for the first time and the EL node is not synced, then it will enter the syncing state. But then once it has synced, we kind of enter this other phase where we extend the chain in the EL one by one. And I guess in this mode, we do want to actually enforce the inclusion list. So perhaps, yeah, I mean, does it matter? Like, I mean, is it okay for the EL to just decide it by itself when it will apply these rules, or is it something that the consensus layer needs to have a hand in as well? I mean, is there going to be something like a flag from the consensus layer that says, please validate the inclusion list for this block?
Right. So I think one way to do this is just like if the CL passes the inclusion list, then you check. If the CL doesn't pass it, then you don't check. So let CL drive
Yeah.
it, and then the other design is just we can let the EL drive it as well, meaning that if it's a current slot, then CL doesn't pass anything, then something's wrong. Then basically you will return error. I honestly don't know what's the best way to go about this. I am not like an engine API like expert in this regard. But yeah, I guess this is something that we should get feedback from you and everyone else.
Yep.
But yeah, we will open a PR and please feedback.
All right, so I will open a PR to Geth repo following what we just discussed. So the EL will just trust CL about the IL constraint. So CL has a responsibility to pass IL only if the payload is for the latest slot.
Okay, that sounds great. Maybe a more like high-level general question is how important is it to coordinate efforts between CL and EL? Like, I mean, we've just seen it, like you have like some crossover and like some questions, but like do both need to move at the same speed or not? And same question with clients. Like, do we try to coordinate so every client like moves at like sort of the same speed, or should just people move at their own pace and other can catch up?
I think there's like two ways to do this. I am sort of tackling the engine API first, just because I think that's probably the part that's to me seems most like complicated in a way. So I think it's important to have like a good engine API definition that both CL and EL agree upon. So I just asked like Jim whether he can open a PR against the engine API repo and people can review that. So I like for example, I was reviewing Jacob's work, and there's like some discrepancy between Jinhoon and Jacob, for example. For example, like Jacob, he actually uses the payload attribute to send inclusion this to the EL, meaning that once you do that, it kind of becomes a net slot inclusion this property versus the current slot. So yeah, so I think it's kind of important to agree upon those details so we can kind of so we can move towards the interrupt. I guess there is another way we can go about implementing it. That is just like implement CL first, just do the sync and do the validator client stuff, and then do the engine API last. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong way of doing this. I mean, it's also personal preference, but for me, I'm doing the engine API first.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have like an opinion on this, or because now it sounds like basically it's a matter of preferences, but maybe it would be nice to have like some coordination at first and so to move faster afterwards.
Well, speaking of move faster, is there a timeline that we'd like to set for first DevNet? Does anybody have a sense of how long implementation is going to take? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, 10 years?
I guess for Prism, I probably can do everything within, let's say, maybe within 2 weeks. I mean, it could be faster, but I probably should pay more attention to Petra since DevNet 5 is like slightly urgent. But yeah, I think within 2 weeks it's very feasible to have some sort of basic interrupt working.
Although that would get into the holidays, so maybe end of January then, give people 2 weeks in January and then 2 weeks fudge factor and shoot for initial timeline of the first DevNet, say end of January, maybe, I don't know.
People are also more than welcome to try local DevNet. I think like kurtosis, for example, is very feasible, possible with that. But yeah, I think end of January sounds feasible.
Does any other person agree on the timeline? Okay, Enrico said makes sense. What about people on the EL maybe? So I think yeah, it's also like about like the question of like who amongst like the client devs might think they won't have time to do it and would like to need help from external contributors.
Yeah, so from Nethermind, I'm not sure who will be implementing it. We need to discuss it internally, but I think end of January, it's like a month and a half from now, so we should be ready to have someone to work on it and to have something to be able to join the net.
Okay, nice, awesome. And are there any other clients that are here? Yeah, Gev, I guess, Felix or I mean,
I mean, we don't have we literally have not looked at this proposal at all. So for me, it's just kind of something new anyway. I know that I think Gian was working on it. Yeah. So I guess we will just check out the diff there and then also just see what's the scope. I would just be very interested to hear from the experts here on this proposal, what is the extent of the execution layer changes that is required. Could someone just give like a very brief overview of like what the execution layer needs to do in this scheme?
So yeah, so the execution layer needs to provide inclusion list when the CL require a request for it. The exact construction algorithm is not specified, but current GET implementation just order member transactions by priority fee and then pick them up until it reaches 8 kibibytes. And the next thing is EL needs to, for our testers, EL needs to verify if the payload follows IL constraints. So it checks if there is any transactions of inclusion list that is not included in the payload. And if such transaction is found, then it checks if it is possible to append the transaction at the end of execution payload. So if the block is not full, and if it is possible to append the transaction at the end of the payload, then the payload is not following IL constraints. And the third change is for proposer, you need to hear all IL submitted by IL committee members, and then make a one inclusion list to pass your so you need to pass that inclusion list to update your payload in the middle of building process. So that changes the building, how can I say, like building process currently implemented in the under miner.go file. And
yeah, so it sounds like most changes are basically in the block construction. So this is basically just coming up with the inclusion list, is what I'm understanding. Like that's the most work. But there must also be some place where we basically then validate this like inclusion list constraint in the block.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a particular way of checking whether like transactions are valid that we kind of specified, not as an actual spec, but like the rules are specified in the EIP. And then maybe like it's a good place to mention that we have ideas around like the inclusion rules that should be used, like because you can build your inclusion list based on many criterias, and we want a diversity of criteria to probably be implemented there. So it could be, based on like the time transactions have been pending on the mempool, and then like order by priority fee, for example. So we have ideas of like default, but but it would be nice to mention like ideally we have like different clients that can implement different rules, because it makes the whole thing just harder to game.
Okay, so basically there's also some freedom of choice there for the clients to come up with the the freedom is in like coming up with the inclusion list, right? Or no?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So how you build your inclusion list in the first place, there is some freedom there. I think some attacks, like we have thought of like very specific attacks, like kind of mempool flooding or like FOCIL flooding. We have written about this quite a lot. So we have like some defaults we have in mind, but I think ultimately like coming up with like a diversity of rules as default is would be like also something nice to do. But the freedom is in building the inclusion list in the first place.
All right, thanks. Yeah, this was very helpful for me.
Yeah, and then to follow up on what Jihun said, I think most people, like testers, the proposers, I mean, they all have to basically do the same thing, which is like monitoring like inclusion lists that are broadcast by IL committee members and like making sure they see these inclusion lists, so they can either like propose an execution payload that follows the constraints or validate whether like the transactions in the ILs were actually included in the payload and determine whether they want to vote for it as testers. I see there are some discussions in the chat about the actual size of ILs. Yeah, what do people think? I scrolling back now. I guess why 16 and why 8 kilobytes? It was a general heuristic based on how much bandwidth we want to dedicate to ILs in general. I guess that's what Francesco said. So we just like didn't want to add like too much load because every validator, like every attester and the proposer will have to run this. So we don't want to put like too much constraints, especially on the bandwidth size, because we know it's already quite, I mean, it's like a bottleneck. And yeah, so also seeing the ideas targeting Fusaka. Just want to put it out there, like we'll see how it goes and everything, but that's like the general idea we have in mind.
It's actually a really good point. I mean, we are in full hard fork season. Maybe that is too aggressive end of January to go February, March to be realistic.
Wait, can you repeat? Sorry.
So it was Lucas brought up that we're in hard fork season trying to get to Pectra, and maybe it is kind of silly to, I mean, to rush it or to push it with such priority. Maybe February is better, end of February.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll let you all decide on how you want to work on this, but I feel like there is some kind of traction behind it. I would leave it up to like people to see whether they want to try and move forward with this. But yeah, I think like everyone will work at different speeds at the end of the day in any case.
Right. I also plus one to that. I think like I don't think like there should be like a hard deadline saying that like we must interrupt by then. But I think what's more important is some sort of incremental progress that we have people like continuously looking at that at their free time, even though it doesn't sacrifice like what is a priority right now, which is Petra. So basically, if client team has free resources, this is just basically looking at the spec, understanding the problem is very important.
Yeah, I want to second that. That's also why I mentioned like if like anyone needs like additional help from external contributors, because I feel like it's better to have like this kind of continuous iteration towards like a DevNet we all are comfortable with, rather than having like sort of breaks between the development and the research and the whole process. So I'd rather have like client devs saying, well, no, we just want to focus on like the hard forks and shipping things right now, which is completely fine. But then I would love to maybe like find someone else to like try to start making progress, and maybe then they can review it, rather than having like these huge like breaks of like 2 months and nothing happens because there's a hard fork and then people have to get back on it, and I don't know, you lose a bit of the continuity.
Maybe we take the approach of have another call. I don't know if 2 weeks is the right timeline for the next call. Maybe we do, 2 weeks into January, just because the holidays are right around the corner. And then we can discuss timelines, see who's got forward progress in order to maybe do some private dev nets or setting up kurtosis.
Yeah. I feel like maybe, yeah, start like first week of January might be okay. Like, or first or second, like start of January, after the holidays are all passed and everything, reconvene. So that would be like, yeah, a bit more than 2 weeks. Maybe we can say like three weeks, because it doesn't actually fall like the weird holiday times. But how does that sound? Like, let's maybe aiming for like the first week of January or beginning of the second or something.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think makes sense. I can keep working on Geth to save their resources if it's okay with Geth team. And we also have, I'm not sure about Jacob's progress, but he's also working on Lighthouse and Red. So as long as we have some rough consensus on the engine API specs, maybe we can try to run DevNet with 2 CL and 2 ELs.
Do you have any spec tests for the FOCIL or any kind of like high integration testing?
I don't think we have it yet.
No, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like that is a little bit higher leverage than doing dev nets, because dev nets are, especially at this stage, it's like what can you really test? And you can't repeat those tests that easily. So it's like you've made sure that the clients can speak to each other, like, kind of smoke test verification. But I feel like we put a lot of efforts into these dev nets at early stages, and I think it takes a lot of time to get the thing working, and the time might be like more high ROI if some tests are written in Hive where the clients who are implementing FOSSIL just know that they could run against Hive, and once they pass this test suite, that's like relatively good coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is just figuring out how to even test the application of these rules. I mean, since the heuristics are kind of arbitrary in the clients, I mean, I guess there must be some boundaries for what they are allowed to do in the inclusion list. I'm not fully familiar with the proposal, but if the client comes up with like an inclusion list that's impossible to satisfy, then I guess, yeah, I mean, that is also something that shouldn't really happen. So there needs to be some kind of testing format that basically make sure the clients behave in a sensible way. And Hive is pretty ideal for that because you have the full functionality of the client available. So you can send transactions to it and then check that they get included when block building and things like that. So you can actually just test the whole mechanics of like integration of the client's transaction pool together with that and stuff like that. But then there also just need to be some hard tests for the validation logic, where it's like if the clients, are supposed to check that the transactions that were in the inclusion list have been included, then that thing just this needs to be in the testing pipeline. And I'm pretty sure that at this point we need to get the actual testing team involved and make sure they can fit it within their format and things like that. And they are definitely busy right now just building tests for Pectra, so they will not be there second week of January ready to create tests for this. Like for them, it's very much like they work on the fork until the fork is over, and then they start with the next. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the second point, second application makes sense, like actually enforcing like that transactions were included. For the first one, I agree with Francesco. Like the rules can be a bit hard to test because like it's a bit arbitrary, and like you could like construct inclusion lists with no rules or with random things and it will still probably pass. But yeah, on the test versus like DevNets part of thing, okay, so maybe it would be better to start with tests, but like testing teams who like will never be ready to implement things by mid-January or end of January. So given this, like if there is huge discrepancy in like a resource constraints from like testing to people that can actually build DevNets, we can also just like go by that and have interested people build what they know how to build, and then when testing teams are available, they can chime in, because I also feel like maybe if we wait for testing teams to be ready and not build anything in the meantime, um, it might not make sense.
So for sure, since this is a very, very engine API driven proposal, when it comes to testing the execution layer, we have to make sure that the testing infrastructure for the engine API is up to date. And at the moment, it is kind of in a bit of a sorry state in Hive with the engine API testing, because yeah, especially for Geth, it doesn't fully work with these tests anymore, even because we removed a lot of functionality around the merge. So basically the Geth of today wouldn't really be able to, perform the merge again, but the tests kind of still expected to. So that is something that needs to be picked up basically before we can start creating these kinds of tests, just to make sure that the testing pipeline is actually working for the engine API. Yeah. But I will just relay this to the testing team as well, just because I'm already in discussions with them around this.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. If it's great if you can actually relate this to them, and maybe I'll also try to reach out to some people in the testing team to at least check whether they are available and if they need help. Does anyone? So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would just have one other question. I mean, there are other EIPs like EPBS or something like this that people want to include in the next hard fork. Did somebody already have a look how they are compatible, if they are compatible, or if there are any I don't know, any issues or something like this?
Yeah, we did have a look. There are quite a lot of back and forth in the inclusion list channel on the Ethereum Discord already about this exactly. Terence obviously has been quite involved in both proposals. So, but we've all looked at this, and at least if I remember correctly, there is no like inherent like incompatibilities between the proposals. There might be like some small overlap in like the timing resources that are the timings you have to adjust so that FOCIL and EPBS can coexist without making like sacrifices. But there is no like inherent incompatibilities at all.
Yeah,
Okay,
to add
perfect.
on to that,
Thanks.
I think it's better to treat them as different proposals. Don't like tightly couple them. But with EPBS, we do get that for choice, the block slot thing that Francesco mentioned earlier for free. But also we could also do it as an independent EIP as well. So yeah, I think it's better to treat them as independent proposals.
Yeah, Matthew?
Two small questions just from an implementation standpoint or discussion standpoint. Does anybody have an issue moving this to Tuesday, the call Tuesday the 7th? So that it's just for APAC, it's 10 p.m. on Friday night. It makes it hard for the weekend here. Kind of a small thing if there's not a big deal. Just a question. And then we could do that in Discord. And then the second question is about just how the discussion happens. Telegram is a great medium, but I'm curious if anybody else agrees that the difficulty of discussion in Telegram and Discord and Twitter and all of the various communication mediums makes it a little disjointed. If maybe we could avoid using the Telegram channel, just as a general point of discussion, and move it to Discord, to that IL list that was mentioned at the beginning, and try to avoid the private discussion. Curious what everybody's thoughts about that are.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also early enough that we can do that. Like if we can actually have a push and like everyone contribute in the Discord channel instead of in Telegram groups, I think it's a right time to signal it. Yeah, I think a good combination would be like Discord discussions plus we have this site that we will try to keep up to date. Let me link it. That June actually worked on. Okay. And yeah, what I want to do with this is to keep it up to date and maybe like keep like the different GitHub forks and progress on implementation quite up to date there on like the different clients, so people can just like go there and click on it. So we'll probably dedicate a section to that and update it according to progress. So we have like a common place that's kind of stable and not like a Discord-like thing that keeps moving on, that everyone can check. Maybe a small caveat is like if any external contributor, for example, or more like junior dev is interested in contributing, like still feel free to reach out by Telegram and like asking me questions or anyone questions, like and then we can like take it to the public. Like it shouldn't be like a blocker for anyone to try and ask questions about the proposal in general or implementation or whether they want to help. Yeah. Maybe leading to that, because we are running out of time. I know I recognize in the call like some external contributors that signaled interest in helping. If anyone who like wants to say something and like yeah, now is probably a good time.
So if there are external contributors that would like to prototype this in Nevermind, yeah, sure, go ahead. We'll free to collaborate. Not sure if much people, a lot of people know C# though, so it might be a blocker.
Right. No, but well, that's good for you to signal it though. Are people happy to ship FOCIL plus PeerDAS? I'm happy. What do people think generally about like the timelines and like the forks?
So if I can comment, Fusaka is already quite big, so that's definitely like I have flashbacks from Spectra, right? So when we tried to cram a lot of things and we in the end had to chop some things, and it looks already stretched.
Yeah, it's probably quite early anyways. Okay. Manav just messaged me and say he is interested in maybe helping with the lighthouse. So that's something that can work. I will talk to Jacob about it, who's been working on it too. Is anyone from Lighthouse here? No. Okay. Well, I'll just reach out and talk to Jacob then. And then yes, okay. I see discussions about the scheduling already. Of course, I'm a bit biased, so I would like also to be shipped as soon as possible, because I do think we have a quite obvious and big problem with censorship resistance right now. But it's probably also like quite early to talk about it, and would be nice to have everyone like looped in if we actually consider talking about inclusion and everything. Okay. Any last outstanding questions or comments? Or otherwise we can just call it the end of the first FOCIL breakout room.
So are we changing the meeting times?
Yeah, I couldn't follow the chat. Can anyone like speak?
I think Matthew asked if we can change it to Tuesdays.
Yeah, this is completely fine to me.
I think I have a weekly and others have a weekly meeting, unless I'm mistaken, on Tuesdays.
Weekly. Yeah, okay. Maybe let's like schedule the next call first, and then like talk about like a regular cadence. But on Tuesday for the next call, for example, would work, and then we can just go from there. And I feel like it depends on the progress too. Like if people have like a lot of questions and comments and progress on the implementation, might make sense to do it weekly. But otherwise, we can maybe like do it bi-weekly or something. Maybe that's something we can discuss on the next call based on like how everyone progressed.
Why don't we put a poll on the Discord channel and just put some times up and see what works for most people? How's that sound?
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, awesome. Yeah, well, thanks a lot everyone for attending. I'm actually very excited about like seeing some progress on the implementation side after like having worked on it on the research side for a while. So yeah, it's great to see you all, and let's meet after the holidays, after the vacations, and yeah, thanks for being here.